In 2017, researchers unlocked one of humanity's most enduring mysteries using something unprecedented: actual genetic material from ancient Egyptian mummies. These samples came from Abu Sir el-Melek, a burial site in Middle Egypt along the Nile, where real people, priests, farmers, merchants, administrators had been preserved for thousands of years. Some lived under pharaohs, whose names echo through history. Others existed centuries before the Common Era. Wrapped in linen, treated with natron salt, and sealed in stone chambers, their ancient DNA had been waiting. The scientists compared genomes, mapped haplogroups, genetic family trees tracking populations through millennia of migration, and cross-referenced these ancient samples against living populations worldwide. They accounted for contamination risks that make ancient DNA work so technically demanding, using multiple methods to verify their findings. When the results arrived, published in Nature Communications, one of the world's most respected scientific journals, they unsettled millions. Not because the methodology was flawed. This was some of the most rigorous ancient DNA research ever conducted, but because the findings complicated a narrative many Black Americans had embraced about the true identity of ancient Egyptians. Simultaneously, these results resurrected questions mainstream history had spent decades dismissing about the Africa that existed before anyone decided where its story could begin. This isn't simple, and it was never going to be, because asking who built the pyramids, who mummified their dead along the Nile, who worshipped Ra and Osiris and Isis, that question sits where genetics, archaeology, identity, colonialism, and the unresolved grief of a deliberately erased ancestry all converge. No clean answers exist here, only layers demanding examination. We're going to explore all of it: the science, the findings, what they confirmed, what they overturned, and what remains completely unresolved. We'll discuss what Black American DNA actually contains, where it originates, and why comparing it to ancient Egyptian mummies produces results that, depending on which data layer you examine, either shuts a door or opens an entirely different one. We'll cover the Black Pharaohs, the Green Sahara, the haplogroups appearing in both mummy samples and modern African American genomes. We'll examine Egyptology's own history and why framing certain scientific questions is never politically neutral. By the end, you'll understand why scientists who've devoted careers to ancient DNA insist Egypt and Africa's story is far more complicated than one study can resolve, and why so many Black Americans instinctively feel that mainstream history has lied about who built one of civilization's greatest achievements. That feeling, it turns out, isn't without evidence. Every human alive today descends from populations that lived in Africa. This is undisputed. The out-of-Africa migration that populated Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Pacific Islands occurred roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. Those who left carried only a subset of genetic diversity already existing on the continent. Africa itself remained Earth's most genetically diverse landmass because the oldest lineages, humanity's deepest family tree branches, never departed. Genetic distance between two people from different African populations can exceed the distance between a European and an East Asian. The continent is that ancient, the variation that profound. The Nile Valley hosted human populations for tens of thousands of years before pharaonic civilization emerged. The river corridor served as a highway connecting sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world long before monuments rose or writing systems developed. Archaeological evidence shows that pre-dynastic Egypt's populations, Egypt before 3100 BCE, before Upper and Lower Egypt unified under the first pharaoh, were deeply connected to neighboring African populations southward. Their pottery traditions, burial practices, and cattle herding economy all shared deep roots with cultures further south and west across the continent. Then there was the African humid period, the Green Sahara, lasting from roughly 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, when the Sahara wasn't desert but grassland with rivers, lakes, and abundant wildlife. Rock art from this period, found deep in today's Saharan interior, depicts hippopotamuses, crocodiles, cattle, and human figures engaged in rituals strikingly resembling later Egyptian religious practice. Human populations moved across this landscape freely, with substantial gene flow between West Africa, East Africa, North Africa, and regions now called the Middle East and Levant. This movement shaped everyone's genetic makeup regionally, until the Sahara dried out, severing these connections and suddenly dividing populations that had maintained continuous contact for thousands of years by one of Earth's most inhospitable environments. The Green Sahara period means the genetic relationship between ancient Egyptians and sub-Saharan African populations is far older and deeper than the Pharaonic period alone. It predates the pyramids by thousands of years, predates writing's invention. When you examine genetic data from ancient Egypt, You're seeing the endpoint of tens of thousands of years of continental population movement, not the beginning of an isolated North African tradition. The 2017 study couldn't account for this prehistory completely, because the mummies they studied came from a specific site in a specific part of Egypt during a specific historical window. Abusir el-Melek sits in Middle Egypt, not Upper Egypt, which borders Nubia and sub-Saharan Africa, and not the Deep South, where genetic connections to African populations would have been strongest and most continuous. The mummies dated from approximately 1388 BCE to 426 CE, nearly 2,000 years, but a window beginning after enormous migration waves had already reshaped Egyptian demographics going back to the Second Intermediate Period and the Hyksos occupation. Here's what the 2017 study actually discovered. The ancient Egyptians buried at Abusir el-Melek were genetically closest to ancient Levantine populations, the region now encompassing Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and parts of Syria. They also showed genetic affinity to Neolithic populations from Anatolia, modern Turkey. Their sub-Saharan African ancestry was estimated between 6 and 15% in mitochondrial DNA analysis, with some estimates placing it even lower in nuclear genome results. This surprised many researchers because Egypt is geographically African, culturally emerged from African traditions, and sat for thousands of years at the southern end of Africa's most important river system. This shocked not just Black Americans who had believed or hoped ancient Egyptians were Black Africans, but also researchers expecting more African ancestry based on Egypt's geographic position on the African continent. It raised an immediate question. If the ancient Egyptians at this site had so little sub-Saharan ancestry, what happened? Were they always this Near Eastern genetically, or did something change between the pre-dynastic period and these samples? Something changed. Actually, many things changed repeatedly across thousands of years of Egyptian history. Egypt was conquered by the Hyksos, a Semitic people from the Levant who ruled the north for over a century during the Second Intermediate Period, ending around 1550 BCE, before Egypt unified again under New Kingdom pharaohs. Egypt was later conquered by Assyrians, then Persians, then Greeks under Alexander the Great, then Romans. Each conquest brought new populations, new genes, new lineages mixing into the Egyptian genetic pool. By the time the Roman-era mummies in the Abusir el-Melek study were buried, Egypt had experienced wave after wave of population influx from the Near East, Mediterranean, and Central Asia. The genetic snapshot captured by that study reflects all that turbulent demographic history, not just the pharaonic baseline, but there's something even more important. The 2017 study found, something buried in headlines about Levantine ancestry. Modern Egyptians today are significantly more sub-Saharan African genetically than the ancient mummies in that study. Researchers noted modern Egyptians appear to have gained somewhere between 8% and 20% more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the ancient Abusir el-Melek population. That sub-Saharan ancestry increased after the ancient period, not before it, meaning gene flow between Black Africa and Egypt was ongoing, continuous, and accelerating into the modern era. Trans-Saharan trade networks operating for over 1,000 years and population movements associated with Islam's spread across North Africa both contributed to this increase. The point stands, Egypt's genetic connection to sub-Saharan Africa didn't end with the pharaohs. If anything, it deepened. Upper Egypt, particularly the region around Luxor and Aswan, the heartland of the oldest pharaonic traditions, has never been fully genetically characterized from ancient samples. The drier desert environments of Lower and Middle Egypt preserve mummies better, which is why our ancient DNA samples skew toward those regions. Upper Egypt, closer to Nubia and populations with the deepest African genetic profiles, is severely underrepresented in the ancient DNA record. The oldest temples, myths, and religious traditions of ancient Egypt concentrate in the country's south, and the genetics of the people who created those traditions remain largely unsequenced. This isn't a small caveat, this is the entire ballgame. The people who built Egyptian civilization's earliest monuments, the pre-dynastic settlements at Hierakonpolis and Nakata in Upper Egypt, dating to 4000 BCE and earlier, were geographically and culturally continuous with Nubian populations southward. Cultural and biological connections between early Upper Egypt and Nubia were so strong that archaeologists have spent decades debating where Egypt ended and Nubia began, in the pre-dynastic period. The answer, based on material culture, burial practices, and physical anthropology, is that the border was porous at best and largely invented at worst. They shared pottery styles, cattle herding traditions, and burial customs, placing the deceased on their sides facing west, the direction of the setting sun, and in ancient Egyptian cosmology, the land of the dead. Nubia produced its own dynasty of pharaohs. This is documented history, undisputed by any credible historian. The 25th dynasty of ancient Egypt, ruling from 744 BCE to 656 BCE, was Nubian. These pharaohs came from the kingdom of Kush, located in what is now Sudan. Historians call them the Black Pharaohs, not as political statement, but as straightforward description of their documented origin and physical appearance as depicted in their own statuary and reliefs. The Nubian pharaohs, Pa, Shabaka, Taharka, and others, didn't conquer Egypt as foreigners bringing alien culture. They presented themselves as restorers of authentic Egyptian tradition, arguing with considerable historical justification that Egypt had drifted from its deepest values under Libyan and Assyrian influence, and that the kingdom of Kush had preserved the original faith more faithfully than the Nile Delta had. Taharka appears in the Bible, in the book of Isaiah, as a military power capable of challenging the Assyrian Empire. His images show a man with distinctly sub-Saharan African facial features. He built temples, commissioned monuments, and ruled an empire stretching from Sudan to the Mediterranean, by any definition, a pharaoh of Egypt. The question of whether Black Americans are descended from ancient Egyptians is not a question any single DNA study has answered or can answer. It requires understanding multiple things simultaneously: the genetic diversity of ancient Egypt across different time periods and regions of the country, the genetic diversity of sub-Saharan Africa before the transatlantic slave trade scattered its populations across 2 continents, and the specific ancestral origins of the enslaved Africans brought to the Americas over roughly 4 centuries of the most violent forced migration in human history. Black American DNA tells a specific story, mapped with considerable precision by consumer genetic testing companies and academic researchers studying African-descended populations in the Americas. The average Black American genome is approximately 73 to 82% West African in origin, with the largest contributing populations from regions that are now Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Benin, Cameroon, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the areas from which the slave trade drew most heavily. A smaller percentage, typically 15 to 26%, is European, primarily from the British Isles and northwestern Europe, reflecting the documented history of sexual violence and coerced reproduction under slavery. A smaller percentage still is Native American. What Black American DNA generally doesn't contain in significant quantities based on current testing and reference populations is ancient Egyptian ancestry. But this requires qualification, because what it actually means is that Black American DNA doesn't cluster with the specific populations that modern reference panels use to represent ancient Egypt populations themselves, largely derived from modern Egyptian or Near Eastern living people, not from ancient mummy samples. The genetic reference panels used by companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe are built from living people who self-report having all 4 grandparents from the same geographic region. They compare your DNA to the DNA of people alive today who have deep roots in specific places. Ancient DNA isn't part of these reference panels in any meaningful way. So when a Black American takes an ancestry test and receives results showing West African ancestry but not Egyptian ancestry, what that test is actually saying is that their DNA doesn't cluster with modern populations living in present-day Egypt. That's a completely different claim than saying Black Americans have no genetic connection to the people who built the pyramids 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. The people who built the pyramids lived in a world without our current borders, without our current racial categories, and without the demographic discontinuities introduced by 2,000 years of conquest and migration since the pharaonic peak. The populations of West Africa that are Black Americans' primary ancestors also lived in Africa during that ancient era. Both groups shared common ancestral populations that existed tens of thousands of years before the pyramids were built. The question of whether ancient Egyptians were more genetically similar to modern West Africans than to modern Near Easterners is a question about the last few thousand years of population movement, and the evidence on that question is genuinely complex and still being assembled. In 2020, a study analyzed ancient genomes from across a broader geographic range and time period in Africa, finding consistent gene flow between northeastern Africa and sub-Saharan Africa throughout prehistory. Researchers found evidence of movement in multiple directions from the Near East into East Africa and from sub-Saharan Africa northward into the Nile Valley. The picture emerging from this broader research body isn't of isolated populations separated by the Sahara, but of a dynamic movement system in which people, goods, ideas, and genes moved continuously across the African continent throughout human prehistory. In 2022, an analysis of ancient DNA from Sudan, from the Kingdom of Kush and its predecessor cultures, found that ancient Nubia's populations were genetically similar to modern East African and sub-Saharan populations with some Near Eastern admixture. These were the people who ruled Egypt for nearly a century, whose cultural traditions, religious practices, An understanding of Egyptian cosmology was considered by the Nubian pharaohs themselves and by many of their Egyptian subjects to be more authentic than what had developed under foreign rule. The Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA haplogroups found in some ancient Egyptian samples include lineages also found in sub-Saharan African populations today. Haplogroup E, one of the most common Y chromosome lineages in sub-Saharan Africa, is also found in ancient Egyptian male samples. The E haplogroup is believed to have originated in East Africa, then spread northward into Egypt and across sub-Saharan Africa. Its presence in ancient Egyptian samples is direct evidence of shared ancestry with African populations, ancestry predating the Pharaonic period and tracing back to the common origins of all Northeast African and sub-Saharan African populations. Mitochondrial haplogroup L, the deep African lineage tracing back to the earliest anatomically modern humans in sub-Saharan Africa, has been identified in ancient Egyptian samples at low frequencies. These aren't immigrant lineages that arrived late in Egyptian history. These are ancient African lineages present in the Egyptian population continuously, lineages connecting the mummies on the Nile to the oldest human populations in the world. When Black Americans examine their DNA results and see haplogroups like E1B1A or various L haplogroups, they're seeing genetic markers connecting them to ancient populations present in Africa, including in the Nile Valley, for thousands of years before the pyramids were built. Whether you call that an Egyptian connection or a Pan-African connection is in some sense a matter of where you choose to draw the boundary. The boundary between ancient Egypt and the rest of Africa was always more porous than our modern political map suggests. The reason the comparison between Black American DNA and ancient Egyptian mummies makes no sense at first glance is that we're asking the wrong question with the wrong tools. We're using modern population reference panels built from living people to try to measure genetic relationships between ancient populations. We're treating Egypt as a discrete genetic unit when it was, throughout its entire 3,000-year history, a place where populations mixed, merged, conquered, and were conquered. We're assuming that the mummies we happen to have preserved well enough to sequence are representative of all ancient Egyptians when they are a small, geographically specific, temporally bounded sample drawn from the part of Egypt least connected to sub-Saharan Africa. And we're doing all of this within a framework that was, for most of the last 2 centuries, deliberately structured to sever the connection between ancient Egypt and Black Africa. This is documented in intellectual history. The effort to classify ancient Egyptians as non-Black, non-African people has deep roots in the 19th century, when European scholars were simultaneously marveling at Egyptian civilization's sophistication and insisting that civilization couldn't have been produced by African people. The racist pseudoscience of that era, including physical measurements of mummy skulls, deliberate misclassification of ancient Egyptian art, and selective use of Greek and Roman accounts that suited European preferences, was not neutral scholarship. It was motivated reasoning in service of a political project. That project shaped the field of Egyptology for over a century, shaped which sites got excavated and which were left for later, shaped which findings got published prominently and which ended up in footnotes. Recognizing this historical context isn't rejecting science. It's understanding that science is done by human beings embedded in human institutions, and that the questions scientists choose to ask, the samples they choose to study, and the comparisons they choose to make are all shaped by the world in which they operate. The deeper truth, the truth requiring sitting with complexity rather than reaching for a clean answer, is that the ancient Egyptians were a diverse population whose genetic makeup varied by region, by time period, and by the specific circumstances of their community. Some ancient Egyptians were genetically indistinguishable from populations we would today call sub-Saharan African. Some were more similar to Near Eastern populations. Many were something in between, that our modern racial categories cannot cleanly describe, because our modern racial categories were not designed to describe ancient African populations. They were designed to sort people in service of a colonial economy, and they have never fit the ancient world comfortably. Black Americans are descendants of people who came from the most genetically diverse continent on Earth, from populations that existed in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years before any of our current political borders or racial categories were invented. Their DNA doesn't connect neatly to ancient Egypt because ancient Egypt doesn't connect neatly to anything, not to modern Egypt, not to modern sub-Saharan Africa, not to any single geographic or cultural category that our contemporary frameworks can cleanly provide. But their DNA connects to Africa deeply, profoundly, in ways that go back far before the pyramids, far before the pharaohs, far before the Nile Valley was the center of anything except the oldest and most continuous story of human life on Earth. The next decade of ancient African DNA research, new samples from Upper Egypt, from the pre-dynastic sites along the southern Nile, from the Nubian heartland, from the populations of the Green Sahara will change the picture significantly. Every year the sample size grows, every year the reference panels improve. Every year scientists are able to ask more precise questions with better tools. The story the 2017 study told is not the final story. It's an early chapter in a much longer inquiry. The Nile runs from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, and it always has. The people who lived along it, who farmed its floodplains and built its temples and filled its cemeteries with their carefully prepared dead, they were African. The degree to which they connect genetically to any specific modern population is a question of time periods and migration patterns and the slow, continuous churning of human history across thousands of years. The river is African, the desert is African, the sky above the pyramids is African, and the people who looked up at that sky, who mapped its stars and built monuments aligned to specific points in the heavens, who created systems of medicine and mathematics and governance and sacred art that influenced every civilization that followed. Those people came from the same origin as every other human being on this planet, which is to say they came from Africa. The DNA confirms it, every strand of it, in every mummy, in every haplogroup, in every living person whose lineage, traced back far enough, leads to the continent where human life began, confirms it. The results make no sense if you're looking for a simple answer that settles everything in a single headline. They make complete sense if you're willing to look at the full picture, at tens of thousands of years of human movement, at the Green Sahara and the Nubian kings, at the haplogroups that cross borders, and the reference panels that cannot yet fully capture what ancient Africa looked like from the inside. The full picture is still being assembled, and the people whose history is at stake deserve to know that the scientists are still working, that the question is still open, and that the answer, when it comes, will almost certainly be more African than the 2017 headline suggested.